I do apologize. I know we have a digital humanities audience and I didn't make a slide about what is a human-computer interaction, but I'll briefly say out loud what I do. So I research socio-technical systems and how they impact people with disabilities. And in response, I try to design or inform new systems and policy that might be responsive to relationships among disabled people and our technology. So if I do not do enough translation work to cross over and be legible to your discipline, I welcome questions and I'm happy to make any clarifications. So again, thank you for that introduction, Eric, and I will now share my talk called Centering People in Information Translation. So I will share some accessibility and content notes first. I sent along some slides in advance. If you would like access to them, I think Eric or someone can share them in the chat, or we can clarify how you can get access to them when I have finished talking, but I have made the slides available. And please feel free to interrupt me verbally if anything is urgent, as I won't be able to see raised hands. So I do appreciate May's help in reading the chat and kind of intervening when necessary. And I'll do a brief visual description of myself in case you can't see me. So I am a white blind woman with my dark blonde hair. It's long and worn down. And I'm wearing a black shirt against a dark virtual background. And as a note, this talk has some discussions of ableism, racism, and transphobia, and I've made a content warning for when that part is coming up in case you want to take a break. So to outline the three things we will talk about today, so I'll give some background on disability and theory. I'll then talk about a project I did at the intersection of AI ethics and information translation for accessibility purposes, specifically on how people are represented in alt text. And I'll conclude with some recent art and activism in kind of this same area of representation and alt text. So I'll start with some information about disability. About 285 million people worldwide experience blindness or low vision. And today my talk primarily focuses on the 39 million of them who are blind. And blind people use screen readers, which is a technology that speaks out displayed content on digital displays and enables keyboard and non-visual gesture interaction. Screen readers are a key technology that blind people use to access alt text, which is the topic of the project I'll go over today. And more broadly, about 15% of people worldwide have disabilities, and disabilities are mismatches between people's bodies, minds, and the environment that systemically limits their full participation. And some people, for them, disability is a culture and an identity. And as Eric mentioned, I often guide my work with disability justice, which is an activist praxis led by disabled and queer and people of color. Disability justice, it has 10 principles, and I'll focus on just one called intersectionality, which grew out of earlier Black feminism. So the intersectionality principle of disability justice first quotes Audre Lorde by saying that we do not live single issue lives, and continues to say that ableism coupled with white supremacy and supported by capitalism, underscored by heteropatriarchy, has kind of rendered the vast majority of people in the world, quote, invalid. And the takeaway that I drew from this principle is that we all have a variety of experiences and facets of our identities which overlap. And when these kind of align with systems of oppression, these overlaps compound and transform the oppression to kind of be unique experiences. So when we're thinking about things like accessibility and disability and information translation, if we only think about, following maybe web accessibility principles, or only considering how access needs impact what an access provision like alt text should be, we might be missing out on a lot of other factors that impact how an access provision is experienced. And so I will kind of go through more about what that means during the project, but I wanted to point out kind of where I'd like to ground my work theoretically and in activism. And on this slide is pictured Patty Byrne, Leah Lakshmi Piepzna, Samara Sengha, and Mia Mingus, who are key disability justice thinkers and workers who have developed and grow these principles. So now I'll transition to talk about my project on representation and alt text, and I've further divided this part of the talk into two sections. So I'll start with some background information. So I have several pieces to this background, and first I want to define multimedia information translation and how it intersects with disability and access. I am not an information translation expert, which is probably made clear by my Wikipedia definition, but I think it's helpful to join conversations because based on the mission of the center, I understand that some of you may not be accessibility experts, but a lot of you probably think about how information is translated, how it moves, and how it's interpreted. And interpretation and translation are key information transformers that help to make information accessible. So multimedia information translation, specifically audiovisual, is a branch of translation which deals with the transfer of multimedial and multimedial texts into another language and or culture. And so some examples of information translation related to accessibility might include sign language interpreting, like the tactile signing I'm showing in the picture on this slide, but also other things like subtitling of videos, audio description of videos, and what I'm going to focus on today, which is alt text. So the type of information translation I'll focus on today is called alt text production, alt text in web accessibility language. And it's one method of making visual information like pictures made up of pixels on a display accessible for blind readers. And so using a screen reader, someone who focuses on this image would encounter the alt text, which is usually not visible, but I have shown it on the screen. It's a crowd of people in a street, seated in wheelchairs, and an American flag with stars shaped in the accessibility symbol is held up in the background. But many images posted online do not have alt text, meaning that if you cannot see the image, you do not have access to it. And so this chart shows that about 0.1% of images posted on Twitter during a data collection period in 2018 had alt text. So that's a really low number. AI may be a solution to low rates of alt text by scaling and automating its production. So in fact, several companies have released products which automate information access. This slide features apps made by Apple, Google, and Microsoft, which use kind of computer science and computer engineering techniques, such as machine learning, computer vision, and natural language processing to convert pixels into text representations. Oops, hold on just a second. I'm gonna just do a quick slide rearranging. So blind people, we know there has been one study that I co-authored a few years ago that blind people might actually overtrust these AI image descriptions that I featured on the previous slide. So in some cases, the alt text might be someone's only source of information about the visual content. And in one study I co-authored, blind participants trusted inaccurate AI generation captions, even when they were told that they might be wrong. And this is really concerning. Going backwards really quick, because AI has known biases, which tend to perpetuate gender, race, and disability discrimination. For example, machine learning models often classify just two binary genders, leaving out people in images who are non-binary or transgender. Next, non-representative data that is used to train these models has contributed to differences in facial recognition, which could be important in automatically generating alt text. So a famous study called Gender Shades showed that feminine appearing darker skinned faces were recognized less accurately than masculine appearing lighter skinned faces. And there is very little research that even understands if and how disability is classified and recognized, but we have documented cases such as like hiring evaluations or insurance evaluations that show that, if disability is detected, that information could be used for malicious and ableist harmful purposes. So there's kind of evidence to show that the people who are harmed by automation techniques that might scale alt text are often people who are currently already experiencing marginalization based on their race, gender, or disabilities. So skipping ahead. And this matters in my talk because AI generated alt text may already be sharing appearance information about people. So this alt text has from Microsoft's app called Seeing AI has given this person a gender and an age label. If blind people happen to overtrust inaccurate alt text, they could process incorrect information about people. And further, we don't know how this person would like to be identified in a description like alt text. And appearance and identity, or popularly called representation, matters in US society today, but often representation information is communicated only visually. So let's consider this text description written by Disney Plus about the musical Hamilton that a blind reader can read. It says, Hamilton has taken the story of American founding father Alexander Hamilton and created a revolutionary movement in theater, a musical that has had a profound impact on culture, politics, and education. So now, let's consider this image of Hamilton cast members. People who can see this image and who are marginally aware of predominantly white US history narratives will immediately understand that the racially diverse cast with several Black, Hispanic actors is making a statement that is only hinted at in the coded language of the non-visual description. So in this case, and in many others, understanding the appearance and identities of people is crucial to interpreting Hamilton and and participating in that media discourse. So as I proceed, I'm going to talk a lot about representation, and it might feel like I'm reducing representation of whole people to words, labels, and people are a lot more than these labels, but I hope that we can kind of come along for this ride, since kind of these label words are the type of words that would be used in alt text descriptions of people. So now I'll move on to actually talk about a study that I ran, and this might be a departure from digital humanities, but I ran an interview study, so I'm going to kind of go through the mechanics of building up how that study was run first. But first, this paper is called It's Complicated, Negotiating Accessibility and Misrepresentation in Image Descriptions of Race, Gender, and Disability. So we had an awesome team work on this project. We presented this work on the Conference of Human-Computer Interaction last year. And I worked specifically with Cole Gleason, Morgan Schuerman, Jeffrey Bigham, Anhong Guo, and Alexandra To. And combined, we had expertise in accessibility, social media, computer vision, and critical race, gender, and disability theory. So really assembled a fantastic multidisciplinary team of folks to work on this project. So our research questions were, how does misrepresentation impact blind people's perspectives on alt text when they are also marginalized based on their race and or gender? What are their alt text preferences for language used to describe appearance and identity? And what is appropriate alt text when authored by known contacts, strangers, and AI? So I interviewed 25 blind people who also identified as having a minoritized race and or gender. And so again, taking up intersectionality from contemporary Black feminist theory, I knew that interviewing people with just one touch point into this experience would not provide me the important nuance about impacts necessary to understand this development space. I chose this intersection specifically because people who are blind really uniquely benefit from alt text to understand visual information. Yet people minoritized based on their race or gender are among those who have been documented to be most misclassified and harmed by the same kind of models that feed automated systems that would create alt text. So I thought that intersection would kind of bring out kind of important benefits and harms. And so we had interviews, and participants brought photos of themselves to anchor our discussions. And I asked questions about their image browsing and posting behavior on social media and other internet websites, their experiences being misrepresented in context, like in both misrepresented when somebody assumed something about them that was wrong, both in real life, in person and online spaces. I asked them about contexts where they seek representation information about others, their preferences for language to describe themselves when based on the relationships they have with the person describing them, like if that person is a known contact or a stranger. And then we had a discussion on automatically generated image descriptions and their kind of understanding of AI bias and how their preferences were affected by that. So these tables show the self-reported race and gender demographics of participants. So I interviewed several people who were non-binary, transgender, and agender, and people who are Black, Asian American, and Latinx. And I will start overviewing the findings from this interview study by sharing the impacts misrepresentation had on participants. The next 3 slides have some racist and transphobic content. So if you need to take a break, I'll probably be spending about 3 minutes going through these slides. So moving on, participants' experiences being misrepresented varied from it being a microaggression, so not having a huge impact in the moment, but building up over time, to contributing to dysphoria or profound sense of unease or dissatisfaction. Misrepresentation occurred outside the context of alt text, but contributed to participant perspectives on alt text. So for example, Sophie has been misrepresented by other blind people based on the way that she sounds. So she said, when blind people find out that I'm Indian, they're like, oh, I thought you were blonde, or I thought you were a white girl. You don't talk like a white girl. And she would ask, what am I supposed to sound like? So Sophie's experiences being misrepresented by other blind people underscored for her the importance that alt text be very accurate. Other participants had been misgendered in image descriptions, including Aqua, who said, it's really off-putting because I have put so much effort into informing people about how to make image descriptions. Aqua does a lot of advocacy to encourage image describers to not assume gender, and so the experience of being misgendered in alt text was particularly harmful to them. And finally, some participants had used products that assigned a gender to people in images. So Creo said, seeing AI, which is an app I showed on a previous slide, typically tries to shove you into one characterization or another. Sometimes I'm a 35-year-old woman looking happy, and sometimes I'm a 50-year-old man looking happy. And these kind of microaggressions made Creo believe that this product wasn't really going to ever represent them. But participants agreed that representation information is very important, and some wanted the option to know this all the time, understanding it to be embedded in social interactions, whether it was made explicit or not. They wanted the same access that people get when they see someone. But several participants were concerned that representation information in every image description might be too much information, and they identified some particular contexts in which they might encounter images where they would like this information. So when race, gender, or disability was the topic of conversation, some participants expressed that everyone in the conversation needed to non-visually position themselves so blind people could understand how to situate and interpret their various contributions. So an example of this was I identified myself as a blind white woman at the beginning of this talk. So if you're blind, you can understand, okay, who's this person researching race? And you can kind of help situate who I am and who I appear to be in this discussion. And relatedly, some participants wanted to know representation information about in the media, like Hamilton, so they could make choices about what to consume, who to support, find role models, and to understand discourse, like if something was being critiqued for a lack of diversity. And next, some participants wanted to read rooms and find community. This often came out of interests in both staying safe, so maybe knowing if they should code switch, especially if they were in mostly white, cisgender, or non-disabled spaces, and also an interest in finding people who might be like them, like a sighted person might do if they're quickly scanning a room. And finally, participants, some wanted to know representation information when it was related to kind of commerce. So being able to find Black-owned businesses or products used by people who have similar physical features to them gave them kind of confidence that they might be purchasing something that would work for them. So I've elaborated on just one of these contexts with quotes on the being able to read a room and find community and the consequences when that is not an option non-visually. So on safety, Yvonne said, so we're about to talk about race, and is this person that I'm talking to a person of color? And of course that hits on all sorts of stereotypes, but sometimes I want to know because it shapes how vulnerable I am with people. So Yvonne wanted to anticipate how her contributions might be received and modulate that conversation accordingly if necessary. And Kai talked about taking an online course. So she reflected, we all had to post a picture to introduce ourselves. And I got an invitation to a Black, Indigenous, and people of color subgroup of the training. Group members could instantly ask me, but I did not unfortunately have that same opportunity. So Kai and others had to rely on sighted people to come to them and build community sometimes. And this didn't feel very fair to them. So now I will go on to talk about findings related to the research questions. What are alt text preferences for language to describe appearance and identity, and what is appropriate when the alt text author is a known contact or a stranger? So previous experiences being misrepresented and the context in which participants desire representation information informed their preferred language. So participants kind of differentiated this idea between identity and appearance, which I know these kind of categorizing can be very consequential, but I just so want to talk about them briefly. So identity descriptions, according to participants, could be applied when race, gender, or disability could be confirmed by the person writing the alt text. And so these descriptions often exceeded the purely visual perception to the culturally significant, such as identifying as Black, but they were still considered relevant for image descriptions, and particularly in the context that I mentioned earlier. But in cases when alt text author could not confirm preferred identity or preferred language descriptors, participants felt that appearance information like describing skin tone, clothing, hairstyles, accessories, or access technologies were perceived of as potentially helpful and possible to do without making some assumptions. So these recommendations are not meant to conflate identity and appearances are not the same thing, but to offer some nuance, as there might be cases when people don't know this information, when they might still be able to give blind readers hints of how someone is presenting. So I'll give some examples of potential descriptions based on the different types of information we have. So here is the base description. It's a person with a filtering face mask walks down a neighborhood street with one hand in their pocket and the other on their cane. They have a short mohawk and they're wearing a jacket, shorts, tennis shoes, and glasses. And the bracketed phrase, a person, will change. So first, if human describers know the identity of someone, they could write a statement like this: a Black, disabled, non-binary person. But when a human describer doesn't know a photography's preferred language, the alt text could describe appearance instead. So a person with dark skin. You'll notice that a skin tone label has replaced race. There's no gender label or disability label. And instead, the accessory information later on in the alt text, such as the cane, the short mohawk, and the jacket that I mentioned earlier, are some kind of appearance information that might help give someone a little more information about this person without kind of making some of those politicized assumptions about who they are or how they identify. The next concern kind of accounts for the broader audience. So who is going to be able to look at this picture? So when the audience is known, participants, I didn't mention this earlier, but talked about, when they're sharing photos around with their friends, they really just want the name. So this person's name is Layla. I did get this picture from the Disabled and Here stock collection, so I did confirm that the words I'm using are correct. So in cases where it's just like a friend's audience, Layla is sufficient. And when the audience is public, to increase awareness of representation in the media, like if Layla were a public figure, the bracketed phrase could be extended to Layla, a Black, disabled, non-binary person, to help blind readers connect that name Layla with how they identify. So next, I'll talk about participants' different perspectives of AI-generated descriptions of appearance and identity. So some participants found alt text so rarely that they agree with Parker, who said, "I favor something rather than nothing, even if some of these descriptions are wrong." So thinking back to the graph where 0.1% of images on Twitter had alt text, this is very compelling to me. And to me, as a researcher in this space, really prompts me to ask, what sacrifices do we ask people to make by kind of generally not supporting accessibility? So I think this is a really interesting finding to kind of dive into and think a little bit more complicated about, like, is this really someone who doesn't care, or is this a product of the fact that generally accessibility is so unsupported that they feel like they have to kind of just take whatever they can get? And some participants were willing, some participants, though, many others, like Tracy and Yvonne, they had concerns about the use of AI to generate appearance and identity labels. So Tracy pointed out the potential labor of misrepresentation by saying it's just one more microaggression that I have to put up with from technology that's supposed to help. I would hate it if every time I uploaded a photo, I had to change something, and that's optimistic that they would be able to change something, so that it doesn't say age or misgender. And Yvonne kind of pointed to AI's potential to perpetuate documented bias, as I already showed, explaining that the people that are going to be harmed are often bearing the brunt of so much other stuff, such as anti-Black messaging on social media that they were encountering at the time of this study. They said that would just be compounded if AI was giving me biased information. And so to Yvonne, the goal was not necessarily about debiasing AI, but understanding kind of what the impacts of potential harms would be in the kind of greater milieu of everything else they're encountering. So for these participants, kind of starting to think about what is an ethics of information accessibility, and I just kind of came up with a few kind of principled things as to summarize these findings. So manufacturers of AI-generated alt text need to build trust in impacted communities. several participants, we had like pretty long discussions. They had awareness of AI bias and had a lot of concerns that they didn't really know how the technologies that they were using for access had been created. And this is kind of a, falls into a wider call of greater participation of people with disabilities in these decisions and in these design cycles. Also, AI generated alt text, they agreed, cannot know identity, and appearance descriptions should not use language, which could be interpreted as identity. And this is hard. You all probably know this because a lot of language is complicated and changes over time. So this really underscored the need for any sort of principles around description to be living documents and updated or kind of often. And finally, AI generated alt text should be opt-in by people in photographs. And so I wanted to point this out because this is a kind of a departure from a lot of accessibility research, which often focuses on the blind end user. But if we think about intersectionality and the broader kind of understanding of how alt text is situated, we also need to consider, what agency and consent people in photographs have actually given to how they are being represented in different formats. So some kind of concrete design considerations might include image or visual description features should be easy to discover and encourage, like recent efforts to incorporate pronouns into platform designs. And we need to do better education on to alt text authors on the difference between disclosing identity, which should be optional and people should not be forced to do, and kind of providing someone with just a little bit of appearance information so that they can have access to the conversation. Allow users to opt into AI generated descriptions and to choose their preferred language, which could be potentially substituted into more vague terms. These design considerations are hopeful to kind of recognize the potential for the scalability of things like automation that automation provides, while recognizing its clear kind of boundaries and limitations and potential like hybrid approaches. So now I just want to conclude with some examples from contemporary art and activism on alt text, automation, and representation, because I am not the only one working in this space. And I actually think a lot of this work is very exciting. So the first example is called Shitty Alt Text, and it comes from Alex Haggard, who's a disability justice activist and writer. And they started posting on Instagram and then curated an exhibit for #CryptRitual, which is going on right now virtually, I think, but based in Toronto. You can definitely check that out. So alt text, as I mentioned, is often hidden. Sighted people cannot at all or cannot easily see what a screen reader user encounters when they focus on an image. And as I mentioned, kind of operating systems and social media platforms are starting to automatically generate alt text. And so when companies and researchers, myself included, advertise the cool things that we're doing, increasing automation and the capability, you might, if you can't really see it, assume that this automation creates an equivalent experience to seeing a picture. So Alex wanted to raise awareness of what a screen reader user might actually experience when they encounter automatically generated alt text of famous art. So for example, the alt text generated by Instagram in October 2019 of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa says, "Image may contain one or more person." So translation is hard. Automating translation is also hard, but this is kind of a very provocative piece on how, what are the consequences of releasing such solutions if they are kind of technically sophisticated or novel. Alex's work kind of reminds us of the adage of picture equals 1,000 words, yet automated translation in its kind of novelty and sophistication still is quite high level and brief. And so this kind of is really a prompt of the need for kind of human-centered approaches to alt text creation. And on that note, artists Shannon Finnegan and Bojana Koklayat have developed guidance for human-centered alt text authorship by kind of comparing it to the art of poetry. So they suggest that authors first pay attention to the language, being intentional about the descriptive words they choose, which can be consequential when it comes to representation, as I mentioned. And then the second thing they suggest is that authors be economical with their words, kind of like in poetry. So kind of thinking about arrangements and edits to make the description kind of flow and more efficient. And to finally keep an experimental spirit, particularly in thinking about images done for aesthetic or artistic purposes, to recognize kind of the artful, not just translational potential of alt text. And so one of their example alt texts of a web page decoration is a lacy pixelated fence surrounds this section with yellow florets in the periphery. And so you'll notice the use of descriptive adjectives, how their placement shortens the overall alt text length, and the attention to aesthetics by using adjectives that describe color and texture to kind of incorporate that experimental spirit and to transform this experience from a compliant or functional description to enjoyable reading. So now I have just listed out a few resources, other efforts. So this slide shows some examples of activists and companies creating resources on representation and more broadly non-visual description, not just alt text. So the first resource is a video called "I'm White, I Promise." It is a video by Haben Girma, who is a deafblind Black disability justice activist. And like our participants in the study, described how prejudice manifests non-visually in the blind community and the role that non-visual description could play in raising better awareness. The next two resources, called a podcast called Talk Description to Me and the Protest Access Twitter account, specifically address sensitive description, such as police brutality, direct action that's been done in response. And these are topics that are very kind of far, that require care and nuance, very far from the boundaries of automation. And so this is one way that activists are kind of stepping up to kind of crowd describe such events. And the final resource is Netflix has updated their audio description guidelines to emphasize representation. And this is really important because traditionally people creating audio description scripts for videos have not always been supported to share things like race. So I wanted to give an example of, in fact, the Netflix series Bridgerton is kind of a case study in the role that activism can play in transforming digital accessibility by blind viewers. So it's led to kind of greater acknowledgement of non-visual representation. So audio describer Liz Gutman released a blog post to kind of accompany the Bridgerton season 1 audio description. So Bridgerton, like Hamilton, is a period piece where the cast is intentionally more diverse. And there was some kind of action on social media when blind readers learned that the cast was a lot more diverse than what they were hearing in the audio description. So for example, Queen Charlotte, shown on this slide, is a Black woman and often wears elaborate wigs to celebrate kind of Black hairstyles. And people watching this show, blind people, were not super happy that they were missing this information. So Netflix actually re-recorded a more representative description track for season 1. And when season 2 released, the original writing of the audio descriptions included more race and dress information. So I just wanted to give an example of some examples of the great kind of activism and art that's going on to kind of commentate and evolve alt text and non-visual representation. So I hope that in this talk I have communicated that information translation, such as alt text production, is not neutral, but is highly situated and contextual. And in the study that I talked about, centering people's intersectional perspectives on alt text and representation revealed insights, including key questions of kind of for alt text authors to recognize their subjectivity, its consequences and limitations, alt text design recommendations to kind of account for the relationships that people have with those that they're describing, as well as to kind of promote more non-visual representation, and to kind of foreground the further development of the ethics of image descriptions, not just as kind of a monolith, but kind of nuanced and based on the trade-offs, the different description types, such as human written descriptions or automated descriptions, kind of using those factors to kind of nuance the ways or ethics we should abide by when creating alt text content. So I want to acknowledge, pictured on this slide are many of my peers who not only helped on this project, but have been part of my lab at Carnegie Mellon University over the past 2.5 years. I've also received a lot of funding over the years from companies like Microsoft Research and the University of Washington before I even started this postdoc. And I would like to say thank you